On the second day of the mission that I was on in Israel, just shortly after October the 7th, we spent quite a few hours in Jerusalem with Rachel Goldberg and John Poland, who are the parents of Hirsch Goldberg Poland, who's one of the hostages that was taken on October 7th from the Supernova Music Festival. Their story and his story are really quite extraordinary, and I just want to say a little bit about it, even though I probably have spoken about them before. They're very, very inspiring people. Like Joseph, Hirsch, with a bunch of other people, hid in a pit just outside the Supernova Music Festival while Hamas terrorists were throwing grenades into it. You will have heard the story that one of his friends actually was taking the grenades and throwing them back out and throwing them back out and throwing them back out until eventually one of them killed his friend. The last video that Rachel and John, absolutely wonderful people by the way, have of their son Hirsch is him coming out of that pit escorted by Hamas guys with his left arm blown off and hurtled into a pickup truck and taken into Gaza. I share the story because they are working full time to try and get the international community to release the hostages. But I also share it because I think when you consider the anguish of a parent who is facing that situation, they are very, very honest about the fact that it is possible that he just bled out in that pickup truck and died that same day. They're very open to that possibility, but it's now almost 80 days since October 7th, and every single day they are living in hope and prayer that they will see their son again, as are every single family member of every single hostage who was taken on that day. 80 days. 80 days of not knowing where your son, your daughter, your husband, your child, your grandchild, your grandmother, your friend, your lover. 80 days of not knowing whether they're dead or alive, not knowing what kind of conditions they are in. And of course we've seen from the hostages that were released, we've heard some of the testimonies, some of those children who are unable to speak out loud because they're so afraid of what the consequences will be because of what they experienced in that horror. So I think of that, and I think of Yaakov and Yosef. Yaakov, for 22 years, it's a lot more than 80 days, for 22 years has, the Torah tells us, assumed that his son Joseph, his beloved son, is dead. He saw the coat with blood on it and said, "Oh, my son was surely eaten by a wild animal. He must be dead." But the Midrash says that he never actually gave up hope of seeing his son again. For 22 years he lived with a slight glimmer of hope that his son was still alive and that they would be reunited. And Yosef, left in a pit by his brothers, sold into slavery, put into an Egyptian jail, and eventually fate brought him to be the second most powerful person in the whole world. We know the story and how it all unfolds. And here he is at the beginning of the Parsha, the part that we didn't read, trying to hold on to this lie that he is this powerful Egyptian ruler, while his brother Yehuda begs for the younger brother Binyamin's life. And over again in that speech, Yehuda says, Avi, Avinu, Av, Yesh lecha Av, do you have a father? We have a father, an old father. He doesn't know who he's talking to. But after a certain amount of time, Joseph can no longer hold on to the lie. And it says, Lo yachol listapek, he could no longer hold himself together. He sent out all of his and just him and his brothers were there, and he wept like a baby. the end of Yehuda's speech, the line that perhaps gets him to finally crack is Nafsho k'shura b'nafsho. Nafsho, his nefesh, his soul, talking about Yaakov, is k'shura, is tied to his soul, to Yosef's soul. And that's a line that we use. In fact, in the rabbi's manual, the manual that, it's all you need actually to be a rabbi, is the rabbi's manual. But if you're visiting someone who's on a deathbed, there's a special prayer for the relatives who are going to be left behind. And it says, Nafsham kushura b'nafsham, or Nafsham kushura b'nafsho b'nafsha, like their souls are bound up with his soul. This idea that bond, especially of a parent and a child, is so intense. After even 22 years and all of the trauma that's happened in that family, in that time, there's still that sense of kesher, like Beit Kesher, of that connection between soul and soul, between parent and child, in this case between a father and his beloved son. And so, as I said earlier, at the moment that Joseph cracks, the first words that he says are, Ani Yosef, od avi chai. I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive? And then, in the part that we did read, when Yaakov hears that Joseph is still alive, when he sees the wagons coming from Egypt, when he hears the other sons tell him, he says, Od Yosef b'ni chai? Is my son Joseph really? Same language. This idea that you've been living for 22 years, thinking, well, in Joseph's case, he has no idea if his father is still alive because he has had no contact with the family. They're not texting him or anything for 22 years. But in Yaakov's case, even though he's believed that their son is dead, there's a part of him that believes that he might still be alive. There's a midrash which I love. There's a midrash that I love that talks about the way in which that news was shared. This idea that even like an old man, can you imagine? Imagine an old man who has believed that his son is dead for 22 years, and you're suddenly going to break the news that he's still alive. How would you break that news? There's a fear that even though the news is good news, that old person might die of a broken heart, so overcome with hearing news like that. Is it true that people can die of a broken heart? You're a cardiologist. They really can, right? People in extreme trauma or extreme loss or extreme grief or extreme shock, literally the heart can stop. So this idea that news might actually break Yaakov's heart. So the Midrash, it's so beautiful. Yaakov's favorite granddaughter, who we don't hear that much about, is Serach bat Asher. Anyone heard of Serach bat Asher? Serach bat Asher, it is said, had the most beautiful music, the most beautiful singing voice, the most beautiful poetic neshama, a spiritual and artistic soul. And so what they did was, she sung the news. She sung the news to Yaakov about the fact that Yosef was still alive. So it would enter in this gentle way into his neshama. You know, who knows what the words of that song were? The Midrash doesn't say what the words of the song was. Can you imagine, like, my grandfather, Yaakov, I have some news to tell. Your son, Yosef, the one you love, the one who was born to your beloved Rachel, he's still alive. I mean, I don't know, I have no idea what the song is, but you kind of imagine the depth of that. emotionality of a father being told in that way that his son that he's thought dead for 22 years is still alive. And then there are so many tears that are shed in this parsha. Yosef's mostly, to be honest. Yosef cries a lot. He cries when he reveals himself to his brothers. He cries when he hugs his younger brother Benjamin. He cries when he finally sees his father, and the father, they go down, and there's this thing, it says he fell, vayipol al tzavarav vayef. He fell on his father's neck and he wept. Interestingly, it doesn't suggest that Yaakov wept. The implication is that it's Yosef who did all of the crying. Yosef is the one who's been holding on to a lie for all of these years, perhaps. But the point is that bonds in families are so incredibly intense. And sadly, we all probably, I do, have some kind of family situation where there's been a conflict, where there's been a breakdown of relationship, where there's been a breaking of communication. You know, I've shared before that my uncle who died just recently, my mum's younger brother, they didn't speak for over 25 years. And they had a reconciliation and they made up. And my mother was very present at the end of his life. But so many families have some version of that. These brothers, and in a way it's the whole business that seems so hard to read when you read all of the ways in which Joseph tested the brothers. Yeah. The way he put them through the ringer, with Shimon being in jail and then Benjamin being in jail and planting that cup into Benjamin's bag, and Joseph saying, "That is my divining cup. Who stole it? Whoever stole it shall be punished." You know, it's like it's been deliberately planted into Benjamin's bag. I mean, it's a horrific story, but it's like when Yehuda speaks to him in that way, Yosef is able to see. It's not just that all the references to his father. Yosef is able to see there has been teshuvah. There has been the fact that Judah, who is one of Leah's sons, right? The whole jealousy between, Rachel's two sons, Joseph and Benjamin, and Yehuda is one of Leah's sons, who is able to, confess his own complicity and guilt. But the fact that it's Benjamin who's on the line, and Yehuda's saying, "I'm putting myself on the line for my brother, who is actually Rachel's other son," right? And so it's a very powerful moment, and somehow in that moment, Joseph is able to see that there's been some kind of tikkun, some kind of teshuvah, some kind of repair, and at that moment he's able to, and there's this reconciliation, which is not clear if it's complete or not, but there's this powerful moment when all of the family comes back together. And that's why I said before about the 70 being a number of completion. All of the family come back together and they settle in Goshen. But the Torah, I think, is just instructing us about the depth of a relationship between a parent and a child, and between brothers and sisters, and that idea of that kishurah b'nafsho, the way in which we're connected. And so the unbelievable pain of those anguished families who are unclear of the fate of their loved ones as they remain hostage in families. And of course, the bonds between a Palestinian parent and child are no less real. They're absolutely humans too, who are also experiencing unsufferable loss. We can't forget that. We can't lose our humanity over that. That's why organizations like the Bereaved Parents and the Bereaved Families Forum are the most powerful peacemaking forums. When you've got like a parent who has lost a child in a conflict, even if they're from the opposite sides of the conflict, they have a common bond of grief and loss that is so palpable that it makes them committed to finding new ways to be. When this bloody war is over, God willing, there will be new opportunities for peace and reconciliation, because the reconciliation is not just between the brothers of our tribes, it's got to be between all people, ultimately. I want to close with a poem written by Rabbi Mark Greenspan, who's got this book called Sacred Adornments, which is a poem on each week's Parsha. And there's so many tears. I mean, even in this room right now there are tears. But I think I've cried a lot of tears over the last 80 days. I think we all have. There's, I'm sure a lot of tears were cried in the Boulder City Council meeting on the other night. There's just a lot of tears that are being shed right now. And this is what Rabbi Greenspan says about Joseph. Why I cry. Why I cry. I could not find words, so I cried. I could not stand before you as a stranger, so I cried. I could not witness your guilt, so I cried. I could not pretend to lord over you, so I cried. I could not wait to embrace you, so I cried. These many years I waited for my dreams to come, but when they did, all I could do was cry. I could not forgive you, so I cried. I could not let you leave me, so I cried. I could not carry my loneliness, so I cried. I could not bear my sorrow, so I cried. I could not bear my power, so I cried. These many years I waited for my dreams to become, and when they did, all I could do was cry. Our tears are sacred. There's a passage in the Talmud that says that tears are the highest form of prayer. So sometimes we can let our tears roll in the pain of separation and roll in the joy of reconciliation, and know that those tears enter into the highest heaven. Shabbat Shalom.